Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the beginnings of the American Revolution. Today's essential question is explain the key events of the American Revolution from 1775 to 1778. So, first major event that we're going to be talking about with the start of the American Revolution is something known as the Siege of Boston. Boston itself was obviously this epicenter of what would be the colonial rebellion, and at this particular time, after what would be the Battle of Bunker Hill, Britain had had a military occupation of what would be Bunker Hill. Excuse me, Boston. So it was very important especially for the new Continental Army, George Washington, and the United States to take back what would be the city of Boston. General George Washington wanted to drive out Great Britain out of Boston. So he understood that, there was no way for him and his new army to match up with what would be the British army head to head. So what he did is the city of Boston, majority of it is surrounded by what would be water. So what George Washington did was that he set up cannons on the outskirts of what would be Boston, pointing cannons towards what would be the city itself. And those cannons were stolen, by what would be other Continental Army, soldiers, specifically men named Benedict Arnold, Henry Knox. The general at the time that was, in Boston, you know, leading what would be the British Army, General William Howe, he saw this. He saw that these cannons were, surrounding what would be the city. So he decided that he and the British Army were going to evacuate the city and basically retreat out of the city. So one of the first major events of what would be of the revolution, especially for the United States and the new Continental Army, you know, George Washington and his army were victorious. So the United States, the new Continental Army reclaimed what would be Boston for what would be the American side. So after the events of what would be Boston, the British, they were gonna get their revenge, and the Empire was gonna strike back. In July 1776, uh, you know, the British returned, with basically what would be 500 warships and over 40,000 soldiers. Um, and this was something that this would be considered the biggest invasion in what would be world history until what would be D-Day and during World War II. So, with that being said, with these 500 warships and these over 40,000 troops that were traveling across the Atlantic to what would be the United States, they set their eyes on what would be New York. New York was very significant, especially when it came to what would be key locations for what would be trade, moving what would be military supplies, but also for what would be military strategy. Washington's goal was to defend the city and try to prevent what would be the British from taking control of the Hudson River and isolating what would be New England. This was very important because, Washington and the Continental Army used the Hudson River to move supplies up and down what would be the river, especially to get, things into what would be New England and even into what would be like parts like Boston. Within New York, the Continental Army had over about 19,000 troops under what would be Washington's command, many of them very inexperienced. Continental Army did not have enough time to train its soldiers at this point. They didn't even have enough money to give them proper uniforms or even proper weapons. So they are completely outgunned, outmanned, and the British forces, that are, you know, venturing into what will be New York are 40,000 professional soldiers. There is also mercenaries too, so paid soldiers that are not British, but these the British paid what would be these German mercenaries, or they wouldn't be known as Hessians, to fight for what would be the British at the time. And these British soldiers will all be led by what will be a man named General Howe, who had to give up Boston. Now he is getting his right of revenge against what would be George Washington. And then on top of it, the British had the biggest, navy in what would be the world, and they had that as well. And the Battle of New York and Long Island is one of the biggest defeats that Washington has as general in what would be the American Revolution. Uh, Washington and his men were completely overwhelmed by what would be the British soldiers and the British forces that were, venturing into what would be New York City. The Washington and his men would have to retreat into what would be Long Island, which was an area outside of what would be New York City. And specifically, Washington and his army could have been trapped by the British in what would be Long Island, and they could have, the war could have ended at this point. However, Washington knew that if they were caught, that the war would have been over. So he had to think really outside the box with this next order. So what he eventually did is he ordered his men to retreat at night. The reason why he did this was because they were going to use the cover of darkness and fog to not be seen by what would be the British soldiers. And he successfully evacuated 9,000 troops, preventing, the Continental Army from being trapped, and they retreated into what would be into New Jersey, and then eventually into Pennsylvania. So they basically, the Continental Army in Washington lived to, survive another day. Even though this, Washington had to retreat, this is considered one of his greatest military achievements because of the fact that, that the United States and the Continental Army were, one step away from losing this whole war and being trapped by the British in Long Island. So very significant. Washington himself and his men are very lucky. And this was something, guys, that was a common theme, especially within the American Revolution, that, that the United States and even Washington were very lucky, especially on the battlefield. So after the series of defeats, especially within New York, the Continental Army, its morale, its mood was at an all-time low. At the end of the year, Washington faced the prospects of losing his whole army because the way it worked was that a lot of these soldiers signed year-to-year contracts, and a lot of these soldiers' contracts were ending at the end of the year. So Washington had to come up with a bold strategy to kind of motivate them to sign on for another year to fight for this war. And what this big plan that Washington and his other generals had was to plan a surprise attack on what would be these Hessian mercenaries that were at a military base in what would be Trenton, New Jersey. Really trying to revive what would be the revolutionary cause, to try to motivate what would be these soldiers to keep fighting on. So specifically, Washington and his men were stationed in what would be Pennsylvania, and they would have to cross what would be the Delaware River to get into what would be Trenton, New Jersey. And this event would be known as Washington crossing the Delaware, which is a very significant event in what would be within the American Revolution. And you probably have heard of this event before, probably seen photos in relation to what would be this event. So Washington crossing the Delaware, this was a huge task because specifically when Washington was, when this event was taking place during Christmas night of 1776. So the Delaware River was partially frozen. Soldiers, were facing freezing temperatures, strong winds, ice on what would be the river itself. So Washington and his other generals had to lead over 2,400 soldiers across this river on Christmas night under the cover of darkness, and trying to do this in secret so they were not, caught by what would be British soldiers and other what would be Hessian mercenaries. So they had to transport men, horses, artillery, so these big, cannons, all in secret without trying to be caught. And it was, a plan once again that, it probably shouldn't have worked, but for some reason Washington and his men had this luck on their side. And eventually, when they crossed the Delaware and they got to what would be that military base in Trenton, the Hessian mercenaries, the British soldiers that were there were completely off guard, caught off guard, and it led a victory that was known as the Battle of Trenton. So obviously, Washington's plan worked. It did help though that a lot of those Hessian mercenaries, were celebrating Christmas that night, and a lot of them were, pretty drunk. Had drank a lot that night, and a lot of them were passed out, and that's why, in some ways, why Washington's plan was executed, because the fact that they were celebrating Christmas that night. So very interesting stuff, but a lot of luck on what would be Washington's side. So here's a photo of what would be of Washington crossing the Delaware. This photo actually hangs in what would be the U.S. Capitol building. So it's a huge portrait. It's a very significant event, what will be the American Revolution, and it's obviously, a very significant event within our own history. All right, let's talk a little bit about another significant event that's going to be taking place within the next year in 1777, and that is known as the Battle of Saratoga. So, after the events of what will be the Battle of Trenton and Washington crossing the Delaware River, a lot of the U.S., or a lot of the British, higher command, especially within England, thought that this war had lasted a lot longer than they thought. So they had, the British had to kind of revise their plans, kind of moving forward here, and trying to think of a plan to actually, win the war and end this war. So there was a British general named what would be John Burgoyne, and he was stationed in what would be British Canada, and his plan was to isolate what would be New England, so basically Boston, and he wanted to isolate basically Boston by controlling what would be the Hudson River, okay, which is technically, part of the Hudson River was located or relied upon what would be known as Albany, New York, which was in northern New York. So Burgoyne wanted to isolate what would be New England by controlling the Hudson River and cutting off the northern colonies. So in order for that to actually happen, they wanted to control the river and to prevent any supplies to get into Boston. If they thought they did that, most likely the war would eventually come to an end, because the Continental Army would not be able to get any supplies into what would be Boston. But the problem was when John Burgoyne traveled from what would be British Canada down south to what would be Albany, New York, he was faced with many, many what would be American soldiers along the way, and it was, Burgoyne and the British Army faced many harsh conditions trying to get to what would be Albany to execute this plan to control what would be to control the Hudson River. But at the same time, eventually a battle would take place right outside of Albany, New York, and that will be known as the Saratoga. So as you can see this on this map right here, you can see at the top of the map where it says St. John's, and it says Burgoyne departs on June 7th. You see the arrow that is going down, that red arrow going down. That's the area that Burgoyne had to travel to get to what would be Albany, New York. And you can see that, there was a lot of different fights and a lot of different skirmishes between the United States and Burgoyne's army. And eventually the biggest fight takes place within what would be Saratoga, which is right outside of what would be Albany. So At the Battle of Saratoga, Burgoyne's forces engaged with the American army, and the American army is, commanded under what would be General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. And we'll talk a little bit more about Benedict Arnold with the last PowerPoint of the chapter. But Burgoyne's, army, the British army, suffered heavy casualties, especially prior to this, but also during the actual Battle of Saratoga. And they eventually lacked resources as well too. And the United States wins the Battle of Saratoga, and it is actually considered the turning point of what would be the American Revolution for the United States, because this particular battle eventually convinces what would be the country of France to join the war and to help what would be the United States. This is the very first battle actually that the British technically surrender, and it causes John Burgoyne to lose his job within the British Army. All right. So obviously, the Battle of Saratoga takes place around like September of what would be 1777, and eventually towards the end of the year of 1777, both armies decide that they were going to take a break because the conditions for fighting are not acceptable, because a lot of armies, especially during this time, do not fight during the winter. So Washington and the Continental Army have to camp for what would be the winter, and they camp at a place called what would be Valley Forge, and Valley Forge is located in Pennsylvania. The problem is Valley Forge is like hell. Over 2,000 men die at Valley Forge due to the conditions, near freezing temperatures. A lot of the soldiers lack basic clothes, food, even medicine to even survive. And then you had over 2,000 men, die, along with soldiers suffering from what would be smallpox as well too, which was a deadly disease that would spread, throughout the camp, and there was no vaccine for it. There was no medicine to treat it. So the conditions itself were not great for what would be the United States. They were losing more men each day, and the United States kind of had to figure this out, or they were not going to have an army, to fight in what would be the springtime of '78. So here are some of the cabins that were, used at Valley Forge. Those cabins were built by the soldiers itself. You can visit what would be Valley Forge as a tourist attraction to this day. And along with this is what it looks like in some of what would be the actual cabins that the soldiers lived in. You see that there was their bunk beds, basically 3 on each side, so 6 soldiers would live within each cabin, and then they would have what would be a fireplace to try to keep them warm. This is the house that George Washington stayed in at Valley Forge. But Washington himself, understood that his men were suffering, and he would write letters weekly to what would be the Second Continental Congress, asking for funds to fund what would be the army, to give them better clothes, to give them better medicine, to help them, through the winter of what would be of Valley Forge. All right, guys. So you guys can start finishing up your guys' notes. So make sure you guys highlight key information. Make sure you guys have 3 left side questions, and then make sure you guys complete your summary, answering the essential question in 5 to 6 sentences, and make sure you guys use details from what will be your notes. And these notes will be due tomorrow. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.